The following is a project of our nonprofit newsroom. Support Midcoast Morning and local community-centered journalism today by signing up to be a monthly sustaining donor at chly.ca/donate. It doesn't take much money to support local news.
Hello and welcome to Midcoast Morning. I'm Joe Pugh. Nanaimo has shelved an alternative approval process for the second time after failing to follow the rules set out in provincial legislation. The city was seeking authorization for a loan of up to $48.5 million to update its public works yard. Municipalities in BC need approval from electors in order to borrow money for capital projects. The city decided to seek this approval through an alternative approval process, or AAP. It gives voters who are opposed a window of time to submit a form in opposition. If more than 10% of electors submit that form, the city doesn't receive authorization for the borrowing and would need to either abandon the project, hold a referendum, or secure funding through other means. The city first ran an AAP on this issue that concluded in November, but a problem with the amount of advance notice given led staff to recommend it be redone. A second AAP began in January, but last week the city announced it had identified an error with that process as well. At a special council meeting held Monday to address the issue, City of Nanaimo Chief Administrative Officer Dale Lindsay explained.
There is a problem with the notice. Specifically, it is on the date of the official notice on the 17th. We made the official notice and it provided it on our website and the newspaper, but unfortunately the actual forms were not ready until the next day on the 18th. So that is the in short summary, that's the nature of our problem here. As a result, the report before you has three recommendations. I'm recommending that Council 1 cancel the current AAP process, that you 2 abandon the Nanaimo Operations Center Phase 1 borrowing bylaw 2023 number 7362, and C, direct staff to return to Council with options to fund Phase 1 of the Nanaimo Operations Center. Your Worship, just speaking to that last item, we believe as staff that the Nanaimo Operations Center continues to be a priority for the community. It is a requirement, we believe, for the continuation of successful operations for our staff and for our purposes. So it's not that we are abandoning the project, but we do, under this recommendation, if supported by Council, we'll return to Council with options, all the options on how Council may wish to proceed with funding of that project.
At Monday's meeting, City Council voted unanimously to cancel the current AAP and advise staff to report back on options to fund the public works yard update. To try and make sense of the situation, I spoke with Vancouver Island University political studies professor Michael MacKenzie.
I'm Michael MacKenzie. I'm the new Jaroslawski Chair in Trust and Political Leadership at Vancouver Island University, and I teach in the Political Studies Department.
And I understand that you've been following along with the alternative approval process that had been going on here in Nanaimo. Just broadly, what are your main takeaways from the situation?
Yeah, so this is really a very interesting situation, and I love talking about political institutions and how they work, and so I'm delighted to think about this and to talk about it. So the city has used this alternative approval process twice, in November and December, and there was a problem with the way that they were implementing the process, so they had to abandon that. And then again in January, and there was a problem with the way they implemented the process, and they've now just abandoned that. So this is an interesting topic because these mistakes have been made. But the alternative approval process requires 10% or more of eligible voters in an area to sign and submit forms in opposition to a proposed initiative or policy. So in this case, the government is borrowing money or seeking to borrow money to upgrade public works facilities in the city. And this AAP gives people who are strongly opposed to this borrowing an opportunity to express that opposition. And if 10% of eligible voters are opposed to it, then they have an opportunity to stop or delay what the government is doing.
So why is this something that the government has to do in the first place? You mentioned there the reason they're trying to take out this loan is to upgrade the fleet maintenance facility, basically to rebuild a portion of the public works yard. Why do they have to get elector approval to do that?
Yeah, so it's an interesting mechanism. It's an interesting democratic institution. The idea here is that we elect our governments to make policy. So they have the legitimacy to do things, and we want them to do things. That's why we've elected them. But we also want to make sure that our governments don't do things that we strongly oppose, right? So whenever you empower somebody, they can do things for you or they can do things against you. And we want to strike a balance. We want our governments to be able to act, to do things for us. That's why we elected them. But we also want to make sure that they don't do anything that the public strongly opposes. So this is just a democratic mechanism that's supposed to work on as a check, a sort of extraordinary check. If the government is trying to do something and there's extraordinary opposition, this is a way for people to express that opposition and delay or stop the government from doing something. So it's a democratic check. It's the kind of thing that we probably as a community want to have as an empowerment. But it's supposed to be an extraordinary check. That is, it's not supposed to stop the government all of the time from doing anything. There'll always be some opposition to what the government is doing. That's the nature of governance. So this is an extraordinary measure that's not supposed to succeed most of the time. But it's possible that 10% or more of the population will be strongly opposed to a policy. And if they are, then the government can go to a referendum and ask the whole population, do you oppose or support this policy?
Now, in this situation, we've mentioned that we've tried the process twice and it hasn't succeeded twice, but both of those times it didn't fail because the 10% threshold was reached. It failed because there was an error on the city's end following the rules as outlined in provincial legislation. What do you think people need to know about that aspect of what's gone on in Nanaimo?
Yeah, so this is an interesting situation because, as I said, the AAP process is meant to be an extraordinary check. It's supposed to stop government policy that is broadly and widely opposed by the population. It's supposed to be an empowerment to do that. In this case, because the city hasn't implemented the process according to the law, what we have is a situation where a policy to upgrade public works facilities has been delayed and possibly, we don't know when it'll be implemented. It's been delayed to such an extent that this alternative approval process appears to be inhibiting government action, even though it hasn't actually been used, right? So it hasn't been successfully used. We don't know if there's 10% opposition to the policy, but the policy has nevertheless been delayed because the government hasn't implemented the policy properly. So that to me is a concern, right? It's legitimate. It's a legitimate democratic mechanism. It gives people the option of opposing a policy, but it's only supposed to delay government action when there's strong opposition. Here we don't know if there's strong opposition. I suspect there isn't enough to delay the government borrowing this money, but the government has been delayed nevertheless because the policy hasn't been, the mechanism, the AAP hasn't been implemented properly. So that's a problem.
Do you think the very nature of this happening twice would maybe fuel skepticism or give people in the general public the idea that something is wrong?
Yeah, it might do. I mean, I think it looks a little bit embarrassing for the government to make two different mistakes trying to implement this mechanism or to use this mechanism two times. So I think it looks a little bit embarrassing for the government. I strongly suspect there's no nefarious intent here. I think it's just a mistake. I think the government doesn't have to worry a great deal about the AAP process reaching the 10% threshold in this case. That's a very high bar, and I think that there is likely not that kind of opposition. When the process has been used in Nanaimo in the past, it's nowhere near the 10% threshold, nowhere near. So I don't think there's any kind of nefarious intent where the government is trying to keep people from expressing their opposition to this borrowing. I don't think the government needs to worry a lot about strong opposition. There is some opposition, but I don't think it's likely to reach the 10% threshold. I think this is just an embarrassing couple of mistakes that the government made.
And when you say an embarrassing couple of mistakes that the government made, is that our elected officials or people working in city staff?
Yeah, it's these mistakes look like they were made by the people working for the city rather than the elected officials. In January, the first notice of the AAP went out on January 17th, and the forms were available on the 18th. Now, this is not a terrible mistake. It is true that the forms are supposed to be available on the first day of the first notice, and they should have been. But the city could have easily made the notice on the 18th rather than the 17th and had the forms ready. So this was really just a mistake. And I don't think it was a serious mistake. It's unfortunate. It's unfortunate that it's delayed this borrowing still further, but it wasn't the sort of mistake that we should be deeply concerned about. I mean, people make mistakes like this. I don't think we should be blaming the bureaucrats for making a serious mistake. This was a procedural error. Anyone could have made that mistake. I think they should move on and use the AAP mechanism in this case for a third time, but do it properly.
At the meeting last night, one of the delegations touched on the fact that they feel the alternative approval process, the notification of the public requirements that come alongside it, they feel aren't especially stringent, and that they feel like a lot of people in the city just don't know that this is happening. What do you think about that idea, that argument?
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable concern. It's very difficult to get people up to speed on anything that's happening in politics, in particular in local municipal politics. People pay attention to other political stories and less attention to local issues. And so that's always very difficult. It is true in the law, the AAP regulations, that the government has to post notices, once a first notice and then at least a week later a second notice. And by posting notice, they mean, telling a local newspaper, or in the modern period, making sure that there's some notice online. But that could very easily go, people could very easily not see these notices. And I think that that's a reasonable critique. It's not clear to me what the government should be doing to make sure everybody knows about it. There could be other mechanisms for getting the word out to people. But the idea here is that, if the government is doing something that is strongly opposed, those who are strongly opposed will be motivated and mobilized to oppose it. They will find out what's happening if they're strongly opposed. And the government was public about the borrowing. And so anybody who opposed the borrowing knew about it. And And so they have an opportunity to fill out these forms in opposition to the borrowing.
Midcoast Morning will be right back.
Midcoast Morning is made possible by the Community Radio Fund of Canada's Radio Meters program and listeners like you. Support Midcoast Morning and CHLY's nonprofit newsroom today by becoming a sustaining donor at chly.ca/donate. Local news can't survive without your support. Another way to help us out is to share this show with your friends and tell them why they should support us. Finally, if you're listening to the podcast edition of Midcoast Morning, go and give us a positive review on Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast feed you use. It helps people find us.
Today on the show, we're exploring the cancelled alternative approval process in Nanaimo. I'm speaking with Michael MacKenzie, Jaroslawski Chair in Trust and Political Leadership at Vancouver Island University. If you've been watching some of the council meetings where this has come up, you would have noticed that there were a number of folks in the crowd who were clapping after speeches, and the mayor would have to kind of remind them not to do so. Why do you think that this particular alternative approval process has brought maybe a level of contentiousness with it to at least council meetings?
Yeah, well, I mean, part of it is that people very understandably don't want to pay more in their taxes, right? We have a very high cost of living. It's been going up. Our costs of housing have been going up. Food prices have been going up. We understand why people don't want to have to pay more as well, also to government. Having said that, I think we really have to remember that governments do a lot for us, and we need them to do the things that they do in order to have the lives that we live. And so what we should be concerned about are governments borrowing money and then using it for things that are not genuine investments. That is, they might, borrow money in order to cut taxes sometimes. They cut taxes and then borrow money to cover the costs of those tax cuts. That to me is bad borrowing. It's going to impose debts on the future. But in this case, they're borrowing money to invest in the city infrastructure. And borrowing money to make investments is usually considered good borrowing. You can borrow money and invest in things that won't benefit the future. But I think in this case, there's a real justification for the money that they're borrowing. It's meant to invest in the long-term viability of a very rapidly growing city. And so I think this is responsible borrowing. I understand why people might be opposed to it, and that's their right. But I don't think that there's a good chance that the 10% threshold will be met. That would require, in Nanaimo at this time, about 7,800 people actively going to get these forms, signing them, and submitting them to the government. Now, to put that in perspective, only 18,600 about voted in the last municipal election in 2022. So this would be a huge mobilization in opposition to this borrowing. And given the past uses of the AAP in Nanaimo and elsewhere, I just don't think it's likely. I don't think they're going to get up to that 10% threshold, even if there was more public discussion about this.
And we've talked about a little bit today that there are other AAPs happening maybe all the time. There was one recently in the Capital Regional District. Ladysmith is looking at one to replace their city hall. Does this particular instance stand out for anything? Are there any maybe broader trends in BC politics or Canadian politics that you're picking up on with what's happened in Nanaimo?
Yeah, I'm not sure. That's a good question. So this institution, the AAP, the alternative approval process, is, as far as I understand, a fairly uniquely British Columbian process. Now, there may be other similar processes in other parts of the country at the municipal level or in other parts of the world. The basic idea of the AAP is a bit like the recall vote, where, if a representative is elected and enough people strongly oppose what that person's doing, they can initiate a recall, and then there's a vote in a second vote to recall the elected officials. So this is going on actually in Calgary right now. The mayor of Calgary has been subjected to a recall process. Now, I think there won't be enough opposition to her to unseat her, but nevertheless, that's the kind of process that is available in other jurisdictions. In this case, it's a sort of recall style process whereby there's a policy that a government wants to implement, and the public is empowered to, in effect, recall that policy. Now, it is used, it's a provincial institution, that is, it's used all across the province. And so there are many examples of it being used in other jurisdictions, as you said, in Victoria, in the Capital Region, and also in Squamish, in other areas in British Columbia. So it is used. It's been used in Nanaimo in the past successfully. It is a functional and important democratic empowerment, but it's meant to be an extraordinary check. It's not meant to be successful most of the time.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything else you think it's important people know about this issue, or anything else you'd like to bring to the conversation today?
Yeah, well, a couple of things. So one, I think the name of the AAP is confusing. It's called the Alternative Approval Process, but it's actually more of a disapproval process, right? It's a process that empowers people to express disapproval for a proposed government action. And it was actually formerly called a counter petition, which I think is a much better name. It's a mechanism that allows people to express their opposition. So the idea that it's a sort of approval policy is not quite right. So the British Columbia government's website says that a failure of the AAP, that is when the 10% threshold of opposition is not met, that this indicates that electors have approved the policy. But that's not the case, right? This language is problematic because it takes silence as approval, which it isn't. When the AAP fails, it means that fewer than 10% of the electorate were actively opposed. It doesn't tell us anything about the silent majority. Some of them may support the policy, it's true. Others might be unaware of the AAP process or vaguely opposed to the policy, but not enough to fill out a form, or just too lazy to fill out a form. It's unclear that this is an approval process. It isn't an approval process. The idea is that this is a mechanism for expressing opposition.
So you think if we were to keep the same basic process but change the name, then that might assuage some concerns in some way that people may have with it?
Well, I think that would help prevent some confusion here. I don't think the name is the most important thing, but I do think that there's some confusion. People are confused about how exactly it is an approval process. It isn't. It's a disapproval process. It's a mechanism for people to express their disapproval. And if enough people express a disapproval and we went to a public referendum on this process, that referendum would be an approval process. That is, people would vote in favor of it or against it. But if people voted in favor of it, they're thereby approving the policy. So it's complicated, but I think the name is misleading.
You've mentioned that if it were up to you, you think you might just try, if you were the city, you might just try and do this alternative approval process a third time. What do you think people need to know about the future, what could happen next, what the city's options are, and and how this borrowing or not borrowing may take place, how this operations center might get built?
Yeah, so I don't know what the legal counsel said to the city. My reading of the process and of the law is that the city can initiate this a third time. I think it wouldn't be terribly difficult to do it properly. They should make a notice to everybody that this is happening as per the law, and they should make a second notice as per the law. And people who are strongly opposed should take action and fill out those forms and try and convince others if they wish to oppose it. But it's meant to be a very high threshold. And I think if the city did that within the 30 days period after the second notice, there wouldn't be 10% opposition and the city could just move forward with the policy. So I think that's the fastest way for the city to initiate this borrowing and implement that policy.
Well, Michael MacKenzie, thank you so much for taking some time to chat about it with me.
My pleasure.
Michael MacKenzie is the Jaroslawski Chair in Trust and Political Leadership at Vancouver Island University. He also teaches in the school's Political Studies Department. That's our story for the day. Thank you for joining me. I'm Joe Pugh, host and producer of Midcoast Morning. Jesse Woodward is our executive producer, and Arby Frew is our technical advisor. You can sign up for CHLY's newsletter at chly.ca/subscribe for updates from our nonprofit newsroom. Our theme song is First One by local Nanaimo band Waste Management. If you have a story you would like us to cover, email us at news@chly.ca. That's all for now. I'll talk to you on another Midcoast Morning.
Midcoast Morning would not be possible without the funding of the Community Radio Fund of Canada's Radio Meters program and listeners like you. Midcoast Morning is a project of CHLY's nonprofit newsroom. Support nonprofit journalism in Nanaimo and on the Salish Sea today by becoming a monthly sustaining donor at $5 or more per month. Support the program at chly.ca/donate. If you're already a supporter, record a voice memo telling others where you're listening from and why they too should support our work. After you're done, you can email it to us. Also, share the podcast with your friends. While Meta is blocking Canadian users from sharing news content on their Facebook feeds, you can still share our podcast directly with your friends via Facebook or Instagram Messenger. Finally, this program acknowledges and gives thanks to the Nanaimo First Nation as we broadcast and podcast from their traditional territory. Thanks for listening.